The Rhode Island Foundation, partnering with passionate Rhode Islanders to lead, transform, and inspire our state. Learn more at rhodeislandfoundation.org.
Welcome to another segment of In Another Opinion, a public information program where our discussions are focused on the communities of color in the state of Rhode Island. I'm your host, Peter Wells. My guests today are Dr. Toby Ayers, Executive Director of Rhode Island for Community and Justice and facilitator of the Civil Rights Roundtable, and Jordan Seaberry, Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Institute for the Study of Practice at Nonviolence. Jordan is also one of our local featured artists. Welcome, both of you.
Very good to be here.
Thank you, Peter.
Lately, we've had a lot of conversation in the news regarding civil rights. So let's talk a little bit about civil rights today. In your opinions, are the civil rights of Rhode Islanders being infringed upon by government or by the system itself? We start with whoever. Who wants to jump in?
As I will say to any questions like this, there are a myriad of answers in a myriad of circumstances. Rhode Island is an amazing place. It has a history that is protective of civil rights and civil liberties. We have the history of Roger Williams, right? The sole liberty for people in this state, and people tend to hold that very closely. That isn't to say that people's civil liberties aren't being infringed on. There are issues around immigration that need to be solved in this state. There are issues around criminal justice that need to be solved in this state, where in systematic ways people are being discriminated against because of their color, because of where they live, because of their income. So I wouldn't say it's a yes or no answer. I would say that we come to this question with this wonderful history. And of any place in the nation, Rhode Island is the place that can solve the problem best, I think, of how to make sure that civil liberties are protected for everyone in the state.
Very good.
And I think to jump on that, I've always viewed Rhode Island not just because of our size, but because of the tenacity of our creative individuals here and the sort of wealth of public advocacy that happens here. We can very much be the best practices state. We can be, we can continue the lively experiment on which we were started and really begin to build projects that reverberate beyond our walls. At the same time, thinking about the history of Rhode Island, it's very much the same as the history of the United States as a whole in many ways, which is a contradiction. It's this paradox, this push and pull between these guiding progressive principles and a reality that is based on, in many ways, oppression and displacement and income inequality and all of these oppressions that carry through to modern day. So thinking about the fact that while we were founded upon religious liberty, we at the same time were one of the most intertwined economies with the slave trade. Rhode Island played an immense part in the slave trade. And so those types of paradoxes continue on today. When we talk about whether civil rights are being infringed upon, nobody's civil rights are protected in a nation that is the biggest incarcerator, the greatest incarcerator in the world. Nobody can enjoy civil liberties if we are rounding up and incarcerating people at rates that dwarf Russia and China and Iran. At that point, none of us really can say that we are liberated in that sense until all of us are.
Well, that's a good point. Now, and it's a good segue to my next question. And my next question is criminal justice reform in the state of Rhode Island. Now, there's been a lot of conversation of late. I know at the round table there's been discussion on it. There's bills that are kicking around. I've questioned the governor about it. And there's different opinions on reform. What say you on criminal justice reform?
Well, I would say that what Jordan talked about in terms of a paradox is is true in our criminal justice system. You know, there have been studies done that show whether you're looking at the juvenile level, which is, you know, that's my area, I work with juvenile justice, or the adult level, there are huge racial and ethnic disparities in who gets sent to prison, you know, in who takes that path from some violation or offense to actually landing time in prison. At the same time, another huge problem in Rhode Island is around probation and parole. Rhode Island has probation timelines of 10 years or more,
Yes.
which is amazing and crazy on one level. It just doesn't make sense to keep a person who has, for example, had a drug conviction on probation for 10 years, where anything could land them right back, any violation could land them right back in prison for the original sentence that they didn't have to serve because they were on prison. And it affects their employment, it affects their education opportunities, it affects everything in their lives. The paradox of this is that if you look historically, how did these long probations come about? They came about because people in Rhode Island didn't want to send people to prison, so that instead of having prison instead of incarceration, they sort of decided in the system to move toward probation, which caused so I guess part of what we really need to keep our eyes open on is Rhode Island has had a history of trying to fix things. Rhode Island has a criminal justice system that actually is better in many ways, many respects, than many other states. But in trying to create these fixes, we've sometimes created problems that are bigger than we ever anticipated.
Do you agree with that, Jordan, or do you have a different slant on this issue?
You know, I agree. I think the problems that Rhode Island is facing in terms of criminal justice reform are American problems. We are, as much as we want to be, and in many ways have been, a progressive experimentation state that takes on these issues. And like Dr. Ayers said, the probation boom that we've seen here was a response to mass incarceration and an attempt not to simply throw people away and get rid of the key. But at the same time, there are certain currents that are inescapable. In the United States from the 70s until now, the prison population boomed, it exploded from 300,000 in the 70s to over 2 million today. And most of those are nonviolent offenses. You know, there are, like Dr. Ayers said, there are extremely disparate conditions based on race and ethnicity. Overwhelmingly, recently, women are the fastest growing prison population demographic. And so these currents that happen on a national level are in some ways inescapable here. You know, we have in Rhode Island relatively short incarceration periods compared to the rest of the nation, but our probation sentences are out of this world.
Do you think that the fact that we don't have a death penalty here in Rhode Island may play into some of this for long probation periods? Because, I mean, you can get 20 years, which is a life sentence here in Rhode Island, for possession of a small amount of marijuana.
Right.
So,
right.
But yet at the same token, if there's a egregious felony such as a loss of life, you get the same sentence.
Well, and I think that points back to those American currents that we're talking about. The, extreme incarceration for drug offenses did not happen randomly, and it did not happen overnight. It was an intentional byproduct of the war on drugs, and which played out very much like a war. It was not a rhetorical battle. It involved SWAT teams and bazookas and battering rams, and in some cases tanks, and it involved people being looked at as enemy combatants who were thrown into prison for, like we said, many nonviolent offenses, possession offenses, and even the violent drug crimes are incarcerated and punished similar to other felonies like you mentioned. And that's a very pointed and intentional war that we are stuck in, and it has not worked in the way that people wanted it to. It has not substantially reduced drug consumption or drug dealing or drug trafficking. Instead, what it's done is it's created an underclass of Americans, overwhelmingly low-income people of color, who really begin to occupy a second-class status based on a conviction. Like Dr. Ayers said, barred from, in many cases, employment, housing access, healthcare, education. In many states, barred permanently the right to vote, to engage in the most basic civic exercise. So it's not by accident that this second class has come.
Sure.
It's very much intentional.
You were going to comment, Toby?
It's just that if you want an engaged citizenry, if you want people to vote, if you want people to be productive citizens, they need to be full citizens, right? Or full residents of the state. If you're telling them that because you have a conviction and because you're on this long probation, you're not able to vote, you can't get public housing, you can't get education, you're perpetuating the problems that led to the issues in the first place. So.
Well, again, you guys are helping me just segue very nicely into my whole script here. But what about police and community relations? Have they improved since the passing of the previous driving while black law we used to refer to, but then became, with your help, Jordan, I guess you were one of the vanguards in leading for that change, but the Seaberry law?
Well, I'd like to first
Toby,
say,
yes.
I was going to say, I worked on it for many years. Dr. Ayers worked on it for even more time than I did.
But you both were the face of this lobbying effort, if I recall.
Well, it was a lobbying, and it was a long-term sitting down with groups of police and community over literally years. Very intensive in the last 2 to 3 years before the bill actually passed.
Has it worked? Has community relations improved at all?
So one of the most fundamental pieces of the law that was passed in 2015 is data collection, which is not simply to churn out a report and throw it in the archives, but to be able to see qualitatively and quantitatively what those relationships look like. How do those relationships change over time? How do they change over place? How do they change across demographics, across types of interactions with police? All of those things that we want to look at in a report, all of those things that we want to take into account when we answer the question, what does that relationship look like? What is that relationship made of? And so I don't want to speculate on what the report will say because it hasn't yet been released.
But you're on the street. You're at this institute. I mean, what's your feedback?
So what I would say to answer that anecdotally is that we right now, I'll speak particularly for Providence, we are enjoying an administration that has embraced community policing. We're enjoying an administration that has embraced the vital relationships between the Nonviolence Institute, but other groups on the ground as well, who are able to intervene in conflicts, who are able to provide mentorship, particularly for the young folks who are at risk. An administration that's supportive of the Juvenile Hearing Board that Dr. Ayers has been working on diligently. And so we have all the ingredients. We have a chief, a commissioner, top law enforcement who are on the side of the community and want to engage. All the ingredients are there. When we're able to look at how the recipe came out, I think we'll be happy with it.
And I think and we can't forget, there are fundamental changes in that law. People think of it as a collecting data law, but there are at least 2 things that other states do not have in the way that we have. So if you are a juvenile and you are playing on the playground and your backpack is over in the corner, it used to be that a police officer could drive by, take a look, go over and ask you, hey, I want to look in your backpack. And you basically would have to do it. The law now assumes, as we assume for most things about juveniles, that juveniles can't get consent. Unless there is probable cause or reasonable suspicion that something is going on and there's something that that police officer needs to investigate. He can't just walk onto a playground and say, kids, open your backpacks. And think about the difference that that implies for a community, where kids can feel like they aren't being targeted, they aren't being harassed.
Not under suspicion.
Not under suspicion, and police officers don't have the power to be able to do that unless they can articulate why. That's really fundamental, and very few other states have, while that's common sense,
Yes.
very few other states have really laid that into the law. So that's one thing. The other thing is that now police officers, when they stop you for a search, they have to articulate probable cause, reasonable suspicion in their reports, and they have to make a report. So that if you have a complaint, they may not, you may not have that conversation right in the moment, but if you have a complaint, you have something to go back to, you have data that a lawsuit could draw on, for example. The police officer also, from their standpoint, needs to think this through. They need to know in their mind why they've stopped and searched you. They need to be able to put it in words and put it in a report. Those are fundamental common sense things, but we have those now because of this law.
And that's, again, you know, thinking back to what I was mentioning about being the best practices state. When we had those conversations with law enforcement, and for years it was a back and forth, you know, sort of tug of war over the issues. And as we came to the end and we began to have these more in-depth, good faith conversations, it really came down to human dignity. It came down to the type of interactions that not only community members want to have with police, but that police want to have with communities. Nobody wants to be antagonistic. Nobody wakes up in the morning and wants to bother or harass someone. It's that we, in a lot of ways, we set people up to have this antagonistic relationship. And so when we see a best practice, when we see, for example, Chief Clements is doing something exceptional, we want to codify that. We want to take that best practice and make it concrete so that in future administrations in 20, 30, 40 years from now, we have it on paper and we know this is what works. This is safest for the police officer. This ensures the most dignity for the community. This really makes sure, this protects the integrity of investigations, whatever the case, whatever the issue is, that it's really important to concretize those best practices. When we see them, we have to jump on it. We can't just let it, we can't just hope it will remain. We have to lock it down.
And to acknowledge the change. I have to say, I'm a lot older than Jordan, so have been doing this a little longer, 3 or 4 years. Back in 2003, when the first racial profiling law was passed,
I remember.
Yeah, you do remember. You absolutely remember. You were a part of that. The discussions, in the discussions with police, the term racial profiling was highly controversial. Every time those words were raised, people's defenses snapped up. Now, it's not to say that there isn't still some of that, but people are much more accepting that that may have happened, that there could be people within a police force who are engaging in racially profiling behaviors, and there's a commitment to not just backing away from it and being defensive, but trying to do something about it. Right. So the wording has changed. The term implicit bias, that unconscious bias that we all may have, that was totally not accepted back in the early 2000s, and it's being taught in the police academy today.
Well, that's good. And
so,
you know, this time goes by so quickly, and I want to get to another couple of points. One of the things that has immigration has been a major issue. In Rhode Island is such a diverse community with so many new arrivals, and we have a housing issue here in terms of a shortage. One of the issues that comes up a lot, you know, should landlords have the right to inquire as to the immigration status of a potential tenant? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Personally, I can see no reason why that question should be asked. Anyone who's here has is here for a particular purpose. If you are in a landlord-tenant relationship, you have your contract. The person agrees to take care of the place that they're renting for a certain period of time and pay you in a certain way. And I can't see that it would come into the question of a landlord-tenant relationship at all. That's my personal opinion.
I would agree. What do you think, Jordan? I don't know if you've run into this.
With this type of issue, I go back to one of the principles that Dr. Martin Luther King laid down, which is the pursuit of the beloved community, which can seem like a lofty, aspirational thing, but is actually very concrete when we think about it. It requires finding ways to nonviolently accept everybody, even those who have wronged you, into this community of nonviolence. Now, to me, and I should say this is my personal opinion, we haven't organizationally weighed in on this issue. Personally, to me, we will never reach a beloved community. We will never reach a point of nonviolently accepting and building community with one another if we continually mark individuals as automatic suspects, automatic enemies, automatic others.
Right.
As long as we maintain those labels and as long as we enforce an individual's ability to eat, sleep, live, build a family, work, live life based on a status, we are doing the opposite of the work that Dr. King talked about.
Good point. Children on the street, and this is going to get hip to both of you where you both live. Do you think there should be alternative school programs to be designed and funded that would eliminate the number of youngsters on the street due to suspensions from schools? Now, you both work with youngsters. You both probably have a very strong opinion on this issue.
If you look at suspensions in Rhode Island, and this is an issue that people have had great concern about, they're very disparate. If you are African American, if you are Latino, in the schools you are more likely to be suspended than if you are a white child. So I want to start off with that and say that there are some huge disparities that we need to address and we need to acknowledge. It seems to me that alternative programs, well, that there are two issues. I mean, you're asking, should there be alternative youth who are programs for youth who are suspended? I don't think so many kids should be suspended. Okay. So that's
one issue. Exactly.
That's one issue. And absolutely, if you need to suspend a child, if you can do it in school, an in-school suspension is so much better than saying, hey, I'm going to suspend you for doing something bad. You don't want to be in school anyway, so I'm going to let you be out on the street. That doesn't make any sense. So there shouldn't be so many suspensions. We should worry about the disparate nature of those suspensions and really scrutinize that. If you suspend in-school suspension and out on the street makes no sense.
Dr. Ayers is absolutely right. I think even broadening it out, thinking about not only the immediate impact, which is a young person who is having trouble in school for whatever reason, and like you said, some of the disparate nature of the doling out of suspensions means that sometimes kids are getting suspended for things that really don't warrant it at all. So you're having trouble in school for whatever reason, and now you are literally excluded from being in school following that issue. One, it doesn't actually solve the problem. It's a burden then on the family who has to find childcare capabilities to take care of that young person. Or, like you said, they're on the street. Now, even bigger picture, think about the ways that those multiple disparately handed out suspensions add up on a student's record, add up on a student's ability to engage with school and engage with learning meaningfully, and what impact does that have on a child's future?
Right.
What impact does that have on the way a child views him or herself, their own engagement with education in the school system, their dreams about college, their dreams about pursuing a career? All of those things are impacted by that.
And getting back to our original conversation about mass incarceration,
Absolutely.
think about the potential impact
The pipeline.
on the pipeline. It's absolutely a pipeline to prison. You know, Rhode Island again, and it's paradoxical. Rhode Island has been doing really, really well over the last few years with sending fewer and fewer kids to prison, to the training school, because so Rhode Island actually does several things well. Other states have a tendency to have juvenile justice and juvenile corrections linked with adult corrections. It's all Department of Corrections. In Rhode Island, we have the adult corrections, and juvenile corrections and probation are through DCYF, which is enormously more positive, even though there are enormous problems, enormously more positive than in a state like New York, for example, where kids will end up at Rikers. So, in addition, Rhode Island has been pushing community diversion over the last few years, and we have an innovation called juvenile hearing boards that we've had since the 1980s, which were operating, again, talk about disparities, which were operating very effectively in places like Barrington, East Greenwich, Narragansett, but not in Providence and not in Central Falls.
But we're working on it.
But we now have them. The Juvenile Hearing Board members were just appointed in Providence, just appointed in Central Falls, going through training, about to start hearing cases. So, yes, we need to worry about the school to prison pipeline. We're doing some really good things to try to break that pipeline, and we just need to do a lot more of them.
Absolutely.
Very good. Listen, 20 seconds. Closing comments. Go ahead, Joy.
You know, I'll say, going back to this issue of the American current and being pulled in, I think it goes really well to what Dr. Ayers was just saying about the Juvenile Hearing Board, that I want to remind everyone that Rhode Island can be the state of best practices. There are states in this country that sentence children to die in prison. We're the only developed nation to do that. And so thinking about the ways that we've made progress, the progress that we still have to make, but that we have to make it concrete. We can't just hope that it will stay that way. We have to make it concrete.
Listen, thank you so much. We've run out of time. This conversation has been rich. I've enjoyed it, and I'm sure our viewers have too. But we have run out of time, and I want to thank today's guests, Dr. Toby Ayers.
Thank you, Peter.
Jordan Seaberry.
Thank you.
And you, the viewers, for tuning in to another segment of In Another Opinion. A special thanks to PBS for making this program possible. I'm your host, Peter Wells. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at inanotheropinion@gmail.com. And have a great day.
The Rhode Island Foundation, partnering with passionate Rhode Islanders to lead, transform, and inspire our state. Learn more at rhodeislandfoundation.org.